Thank you for joining us today, Roshmi, for Zubaan's Cultures of Peace program 2020. For our viewers, Roshmi Goswami is a feminist human rights advocate with vast experience of working at the intersection of human rights, gender justice, and peace building. For over 2 decades, she has been involved in conceptualizing, designing, and implementing strategies and methodologies to tackle gender injustice and secure women's human rights, particularly in context of protracted armed conflicts, political transition, and contestations. Roshmi was a co-founder of Northeast Network NAME, and she has also been associated with several human rights and feminist organizations. She is presently the chairperson of Foundation for Social Transformation, Enabling Northeast India. Roshmi is also an independent researcher and consultant on human rights, women's rights, gender justice, peace, and conflict transformation. Thank you once again for joining us today, Roshmi.
Thank you for inviting me.
Roshmi, at the outset, I wanted to ask you one thing. You've been a long-term activist in the women's movement, and your work has focused on the question of rights, women's rights, human rights, etc. Can you tell us something about the kind of campaigns you have been involved in, and perhaps about some of the strategies that you have worked with?
Okay. When you say campaign, I always think of myself as a non-campaign person. The big campaigns, the violence against women, the 1 billion rising, and such like campaigns, I am really, very peripheral to such big campaigns. My work, I think, right from the start has been more focused on a strategic kind of intervention where one can see things moving. So right from the start, it wasn't a campaign, but bringing in voices of the women of Northeast was like a key strategy when we were preparing for the Beijing conference. And the Beijing conference space was such that it allowed for, because, the Dalit groups were bringing in Dalit women's issues. And it was a moment of time where a lot of voices and issues of women who have so far not been very key or central to the women's movement in India were being drawn into the center from the periphery. So that was like a very, very strategic, something that one didn't shift from at all, a focus on that. The other one was that coming from a region, because of all the consultations we had during the mobilization process, women would always, we would talk about various issues, and women would then suddenly say, what is the point of all this when there is no peace, where there is so much bloodshed and conflict? And at that time, there was huge ethnic conflict and very, very brutal killings and so on. So the question of the need for conflict to address issues of the impact of conflict on the lives of women, to work towards bringing about peace that was transformative was key. So, that was also a kind of strategy. Thirdly, the Northeast actually had a very vibrant human rights movement already, in the sense that because there were movements for self-determination, a lot of the male-led groups were already part of Geneva, Bangkok, all of these discussions, so they were very clued up of what the UN processes were and where one needed to much more strategic than any of the others, because that was the only space or forum where they could raise their issues. So, so we also kind of followed that same trajectory, but bringing in women's voices. And I think as we go along, I'll talk more about that we in fact held one of the first Women's Rights Are Human Rights conference, which was a very, very strategic move of 5 days, where we invited the major men's groups and the women's groups, and together, how do we unpack human rights? And so, right from the start, more than being part of campaign, I have been more part of very, very strategically thought out, thinking of long term, looking at the political context, and using strategies that would move things. That has been my approach, always, till date, I think.
Thank you, Rosmi, for telling us about how you initially, when at a time when the conflict discourse in the Northeast doesn't speak about women, or even the human rights discourse that didn't speak of women, you brought in these gender issues. Uh,
If I may add, I forgot to add this.
yeah.
See, there was also in the human rights movement a real emphasis on civil and political rights and not socioeconomic rights. So, strategically bringing in women, we also brought in socioeconomic rights, not because we chose to bring in, but women naturally raised issues of socioeconomic rights. And initially, the men were kind of a little, they push back on the socioeconomic rights and says, why are you raising these issues at this forum or at this moment? Years later, some of these men came to me and said, you were so right to raise these issues because it involves the whole community. And, socioeconomic rights is what we are grappling with today. So it has to, the fact that human rights cannot be divided between one, there cannot be a hierarchy of rights. Civil political has to go with socioeconomic. I think right from the start, we gave that focus and that momentum, that is how we have to go. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think it is because of this momentum that you have started that the younger generation today can think of human rights as a more holistic, with a more holistic approach. You're one of the founders of NAIN, although you are no longer with the organization now. But when you were there, you put together what is probably the first study on the impact of armed conflict on women. How and why did you do this study, and what were some of its findings? And how relevant do you think that it remains today?
You are asking me absolutely a question very close to my heart. As I said, the issue of conflict and peace came from the women in our various consultations. We needed to do that. Uh, but again, to secure it within a human rights framework was very, very important. Again, because we were bringing in gender, to put it within an international Bill of Rights for Women was very, very important. So CEDAW, Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination, and the support or the collaboration came because of Shanti Dairiam, who founded the International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific, based in Kuala Lumpur, who has been a pioneer in using the CEDAW framework in a very, very comprehensive manner, and Sunila Abesekara from Sri Lanka, who is no longer with us, but who is like the one of the lead voices on human rights in this region. So that was where the push came from of how do we do that. And I think it's not just documenting in Northeast India or in India. I think Shanti keeps reminding me, do not forget that yours was the very first time that an independent chapter on women, the impact of women on armed conflict, was presented to the CEDAW committee. Now, if you know about CEDAW, in the articles of CEDAW, there isn't one particular article which focuses on women in conflict. Okay, but you have to look at it more comprehensively. And so when India presented its report in the year 2000, we had a separate, because of the study, and I go back to the study a little, because of the study, we presented a separate chapter on the impact of women on armed conflict, and that was the very first internationally. And thereafter, of course, every country, every NGO presents one section of armed conflict if there is conflict in their country. But we were really the very first. And it so happened because I became part of a CEDAW monitoring network, which was a South Asian CEDAW monitoring network. And each of the countries, we chose different issues to monitor. India being so large, we actually chose 3 articles that we were going to monitor. One was the impact of conflict on the lives of women. The other one was political participation. And the third was Article 16 of CEDAW, which had to do with the rights of right to choice and right to marriage. And why Article 16 was chosen? Because India ratified CEDAW with a reservation on Article 16. So these were the 3 issues being monitored from India. In Nepal, similarly, they had chosen, I think they were fighting for abortion rights and inheritance rights. So they chose. So, it was part of a very, very comprehensive South Asian monitoring network. And I became part of that study, whatever, the monitoring, uh, enabling the fulfillment of government commitment under CEDAW, and how do we do that. And Shanti Dairiam is the one who led us. She was the resource person. She led us in that effort. We met periodically. I mean, we met quite often actually, and unpacked what the framework should be, what should the focus be. So it was a collaborative checking with each other kind of. I didn't just independently sit somewhere and write this. It was part of the larger framework was discussed at length with experts. And then one started the documentation in the region. And it was really a very, very comprehensive getting women's voices in of the impact. And we divided it into different sections. This is an ongoing, it's a mission for life for me. It isn't just a project that one did and then when it ended and that's it, you move on. You continue. You continue because different aspects of it come out. And as I was saying, I was a little disappointed with the organization that I co-founded because not everybody felt the same. At some point I was told that, okay, now project is ended and so we don't need to do anything more. So for me, it has continued in the sense that where do I see it today? From that study, we persisted on different forums, international, regional, national, of constantly raising issues because at different moments of time of conflict, different issues surface. And you get a deeper and deeper understanding. Again, in a different political context, the conflict plays out differently. So each time it is different, and so you have to persist with that. So from this CEDAW Committee on Women in a Conflict, and I must say I was integrally involved in those consultations in the language that should go into the general recommendation on women in armed conflict. And finally, in 2013, October, a general recommendation called General Recommendation 30 on the impact of armed conflict on women in conflict, post-conflict, and pre-conflict. There is a chapter in the CEDAW, in this, which was adopted by the CEDAW committee. And when India reported in 2014, we were one of the first countries reporting after that after that general recommendation was adopted. And it was a very, very exciting moment because from Northeast, we expanded our report. So this time when we presented to the CEDAW committee, we included Kashmir, we included Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, the Maoist affected Adivasi belt. So it has become larger and larger, and we kind of presented, and a lot of the recommendations that we pushed for actually got adopted, got accepted by the CEDAW committee, and very, very progressive observations were made by the CEDAW committee. And so I lived to see the definition, because, you know, the government of India would always say that we do not have conflict because the kind of conflict which is internal conflict did not fit into the definition, international definition of conflict. So we fell out of it. So in GR30, we talk about defined and undefined conflict. So there are many, many, many aspects of it which has got incorporated into general recommendations. Yes, so again, they was able to give input in the 15-year review of 1325, which was led by Radhika Kumaraswamy, the former UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. So what I am trying to say that it has continued. The work on women in conflict has continued. It has expanded beyond the Northeast. It has included other regions. It included, at some point, I had Nepal also got included, and I think we'll come to that question later. So it just continues. And today, where are we on that? And today, I think violent extremism is a key component of the impact of conflict on the lives of women. And it's a very under-researched, not properly understood phenomena. And how do we unpack that? How do we secure it? How do we ensure that it is addressed within a human rights accountability framework versus a high security whatever approach? So I just see the work continuing and going deeper and deeper and getting more expanded. Yep.
One aspect of your work around armed conflict and women is your study on women combatants and sympathizers. Very often when we discuss armed conflict or even the impact of armed conflict on women, either women combatants are rendered invisible or their contribution or legacy or agency is negative. What prompted you to approach this topic, and what challenges did you face when researching this aspect of armed conflict?
I think for me, bringing voices of Northeast India into giving it a more central place in the Indian women's movement has been a key strategy. And sometimes you bring in these voices which have very clear, especially when you're bringing them from conflict regions like Northeast or Kashmir, you may have issues which may not be very comfortable with other people of the country. There might be a very, very clear focus on self-determination, for instance. So are you comfortable? Can you deal with it? Can you have women who say that we will only support you this far and no further because we are basically involved in a community? Our whole community is involved in a self-determination movement, right? So this tension of what is accepted and what is not accepted, and what is not accepted, can you still kind of dialogue with people who do not have the same ideology as you, who do not think of India as this sovereign whole and that you are part of it? You may not feel so part of it, no? So I think those kind of thinking is already part of the ecosystem when you are working on conflict and women, because you are very often kind of confronted with that. They will talk to you about the Indians, for instance. And I remember my friends in Delhi would get quite appalled, because they are referred to as the Indians said this and so on. So anyway, so coming to the point, so for me, the voice which does not conform, which is outside of it, I have always heard it and have also always been fascinated by it, that how willing are we as progressive women movement to listen to these voices, to bring them in, because they do have something to say. And when I was, and I will talk about my funding years, but even in the funding years, one issue which came up quite strongly was the voice of the sex workers, who saw themselves not as victims, who came in as victims, because very often they were trafficked, or it was economic need, or whatever you join. And then once they were in sex work, then they do not want to be rescued and rehabilitated. They want to continue in sex work. And within the women's movement, there was a lot of tension. At that time, it is better now. There is more understanding and analysis, but they do not want to come out of that, because that is gives them space, gives them a livelihood, gives them a different level of agency which they might have not had, having been raped and abused and so on and so forth. So how much is the women's movement able to accommodate women who do not conform, is again with the sex workers movement that comes up. So for me then to go to look at the different categories in my study of women in armed conflict, I had different categories of women, that we cannot look at women with one size fits all, that there are different categories and each one is impacted differently. And there I did have a category of the women combatants. And women combatants are not all coerced, as is given that they are coerced and they are abducted. There are different reasons why they join. And for me, that is a fascinating story of why they join and what is their notion of agency and how is it played out within that. Okay, so this has been a very fascinating story of women's agency and how they perceive themselves. And then also when the peace process starts, what happens to them? Because you live like 20 years in great solidarity in the jungles and whatever, then you come back to society, and because you want to fit, you conform to things which are actually has moved on. Yasmi society, for instance, is not so stuck. It has moved beyond what those combatants left when they left 20 years back. So it's a fascinating story of women's agency and how they reinvent, and then what happens to them, and then how they are marginalized, and how they could also be very, very important peace advocates. For instance, the Maoist women in Nepal have constantly, the Maoist women is a fascinating study, because the promise of egalitarian socioeconomic equality and so on drew a lot of women into the Maoist movement. And Nepal society is very strict with their hierarchies, and all of that was broken. And then what happens to them when the conflict ends, and where do they fit? And the elitist women then do not want them to be the voices, and so on and so forth. So it's that kind of a focus which drew me into this study. And also, and I will refer to it, and I must acknowledge the support that Zubaan gave me for that we make so much, there is so much support for when there is sexual violence from the women's movement. But I also found that when the sexual violence is again a supposed kind of women combatant or sympathizers, there is a little level of hesitancy about whether they can be supported or not. I question, because the men have told me, but she was not a militant. And I have said, what if she was? Is a militant woman then okay for sexual violence against a militant woman? I'm asking that question. I do not care if she was a militant or she was not a militant, but this level of sexual brutality is not allowed, is not acceptable, no matter who she is. So, you had to grapple with so many, and then the men are taken aback because they are supporting. I mean, this was actually in Manipur. they are supporting this woman, but also justifying and saying, but she was not a militant. I said, so what if she was? Will you stop supporting her if she was? So, you kind of, they bring in all of these little, disquiet amongst us, in people who are otherwise very committed to human rights, part of the women's movement, feminist analysis, when you raise these kind of uncomfortable questions, and we have to be able to raise it, right?
There is so much food for thought that you have, put up for us. Rosmi, you have worked at many levels as an activist, but also as part of a grant making institution.
Right.
How different did the work look when you approach it from the other side as a funder? What were some of the dilemmas faced by someone placed in the kind of position you were in, where
Right.
funding for political movement is often seen as being political and therefore suspect?
Okay. Well, when I interviewed for my Ford Foundation job, the final question, after I think they had already shortlisted me, my would-be boss came to me and he said, I just have one question for you. You are an activist, but you must understand that if you get this job, you can no longer take positions. You will be a funder. Can you live with that? That was the final answer that they wanted from me before they decided that I would be a donor. So I just thought for a minute, and I thought that I may not be able to take positions, but I know all the women who will take positions, and this job will enable me to support all of them. So, I had no issues. I said, totally, I can live with it. And in my mind, what I was thinking, I won't take the position, so what? All the other women who will take the position, I will support them, no? So, having said that, I must say that I also joined a funding organization, which at that time was extremely progressive, extremely so. And it supported some of the most cutting edge work on human rights. We were part of the race conference in Durban. The Ford Foundation was the lead funder. We got into a lot of trouble. Um, and it was during Bush's time, so there were a lot of restrictions. There was the gag rule of what you can support, what you can't. Sex work, again, was something that the Bush administration, kind of frowned upon. I mean, it was an absolute no-no. And the Ford Foundation would have its tax exemption status revoked if we did some of these. But I had such amazing leaders in the organization, the president, the vice president, and so on. We got totally, our backs were totally covered. We supported what we should be supporting. And all of the difficult political questions. I remember the president telling me, I'm so proud that you support sex work. We are so proud that we support and you are leading it. And so it was a different kind of an organization at that time. We could support very, very progressive, very critical, very cutting edge work on human rights. As I said, we supported the race conference, which brought from India the Dalit rights issues on board. It was amazing. We supported work in Palestine, in Egypt. So it wasn't just India, it was the larger canvas of what we could support. And we supported a lot of extremely critical work on rights. And yes, so, and also I think it was a moment of time. And organizations change, different people come, different people go, and so on. I was just fortunate because all my colleagues, one was more political than the other. My own boss had fought for indigenous people's rights, had litigated, and so on. Her parents were migrant workers, occasional vegetable pickers, and so people came from very, very passionate, on the ground kind of grappling with human rights. So all of that was a great learning for me, was a great support. And you were not alone because you had colleagues across the world, one doing more critical work than the other. And the organization was also such that it allowed for collaboration across different countries. So we were able to do that. And it was also a moment of time when Gujarat happened in India. And I must say that the Ford Foundation had supported a whole lot of, made whole lot of grants in Gujarat. There was a lot of money that went to Gujarat earlier. So when the Gujarat carnage happened, we actually stopped and said, where what we asked questions. Where did all this money go? What is the transformation that this money brought about if there was this level of brutality? And it allowed, I mean, our boss was not part of it, but you could ask these questions. We went on a fact finding of our own. We took certain rules that people, if they are not committed to social justice, it's difficult to just support work. So it was great, that foundation. But I must continue because from the Ford Foundation, I went to the UN, and that was a challenge. That was a huge challenge. One would think the reverse, but it's not true. The UN is heavily dependent on funding from governments, and therefore there is a lot of compromise. And for me, that was very difficult. For Saudi Arabia, for instance, when UN Women was being kind of, we were just starting up, I was there then. And the kind of women's rights violations in that country, and then you take a huge grant from Saudi Arabia. So in a way that you have to keep quiet, no, about so many issues. The UN is very difficult, and I didn't last very long, frankly. After having gone from a very progressive and supportive space to something where you are constantly watching out for what the government is saying is a difficult job. Yeah.
You have also worked with Zubaan, Roshmi, in the past as an author, as a participant in their cultures events, also as an advisor and mentor to many young writers who are part of Zubaan's small grants program. Can you talk a bit about your engagement with Zubaan's projects?
What I wanted to say is that um, and I'm not saying this because this is a Zubaan project and you are interviewing me from Zubaan, but I have huge regard for Zubaan, for Urvashi. I find, her sharp feminist lens and analysis so exciting and so stimulating. It's constantly, it makes you think, it makes you push parameters. And that's the kind of work I like to do and like to be involved and be associated with. So it has been for me a very exciting kind of engagement where and as and when Zubaan invites me, I am always there because I know there is something in it, which is worth whatever. So as I mentioned earlier, I was part of the impunity project because, I wrote a paper on sexual violence. And that's where I raised the question of what if you're a militant, is sexual violence then okay? And it's the Zubaan space which allows you, which pushes you to think like that, and and also to be able to discuss with Urvashi herself and other people some of these ideas and where to take it and so on. So it has been for me very exciting to be involved with Zubaan. Cultures of Peace, I've spoken in one or two, and it is always uh, pushing the boundaries, pushing it beyond what meets the eye and what is the obvious. And that's what, and when I began by saying I'm not part of very large campaigns, but I get very excited by something which is very nuanced, strategic, and pushing the boundaries, which Zubaan does all the time. And your work with the young minds of Northeast India. Today, I look at Zubaan as a resource because the outreach that Zubaan has had with people, with young people in Northeast India. And I have had the privilege, I have felt very privileged to be reviewing some of these project proposals and seeing the end product. And for me, it is very, very gratifying that because when we started off, it was an uphill task trying to find people, who would work with us, who would have the analysis, we'd send them to workshops and so on. And today you find there are more and more people, and Zubaan discovers them and gives them the opportunity. And then you see them moving beyond the first contact. I really have huge regard for this role that Zubaan is playing in expanding minds, analysis, creativity. But not just that. That is the distinctiveness about Zubaan. Constantly with a very sharp feminist lens. This is the point. It's not just a project. You may get funding for it and all that, but you are pushing the boundaries with a very sharp feminist lens, and that is what is very exciting. All of the work that you do, these salient features of Zubaan always comes up. And the fact that Urvashi herself has worked in Kashmir, is done work on partition and is part of partition. She brings a different level of sensibility and depth of understanding, which you don't just find, by reading a few articles here and there. So that makes it alive. And for me, it's like for me, it's like for me, Sri Lanka, Sunila was brought all of that, or many others from Sri Lanka bring a very kind, because you have a lived experience of living through conflict and contestation, and so your sharpness of analysis is different. I think Zubaan has that, and therefore I find it very exciting to be part of Zubaan.
Thank you so much for your kind words, Roshmi. Roshmi, you are also part of the Urgent Action Fund Asia and the Pacific, and also the South Asian for Human Rights. Can you tell us a bit about these organizations?
Okay. Urgent Action Fund. Actually, I was first and foremost part of Urgent Action Fund, which is based in the U.S. And again, it was a South Asian, Sunila, who kind of brought me into that role and put me there. And to support human rights defenders is something, and as I go back to, like, I'm not part of campaign, but strategic interventions I have been part of. One of it is human rights and human rights defenders. In fact, the first ever conference on women human rights defenders in 2005 was in Colombo. I was part of that, where Urgent Action Fund, I was a funder then, but and Ford Foundation was a key donor to the Urgent Action Fund in Africa, where there was Africa's Urgent Action Fund was created to address conflict. At that time, it was high conflict across Africa, and it was created to address that. So I have been part of the human rights of women human rights defenders movement in some way or the other. So when I was invited to come onto the board of Urgent Action Fund, that Sunila was the chair and she was the outgoing chair. So I readily accepted, because I felt that this is an organization which is much needed, which responds rapidly. Their key DNA of Urgent Action Fund is the rapid response grant. You have to get a human rights defenders for, at that moment, you have to respond within for 72 hours, get the money out, get them out of a situation, and so on. Very, very political and very strategic and focused. Part of the reason why I was also invited onto the board was that Urgent Action Fund was also exploring the possibility of spinning off and starting an Asia Urgent Action Fund. So I joined the global. I've just gone off the board 2 months back from the global, but then in the process, started the process of creating Urgent Action Fund Asia Pacific. So I am a founder of the Urgent Action Fund Asia Pacific. We initially it was just going to be Asia, and then again we realized, just like Northeast is always marginalized, the Pacific is always marginalized. And what kind of violations go on in those specific islands far away from everybody's eyes is too much, So there, we felt that there was a need to bring the Pacific in, not as an afterthought, but right from the start. So we created Urgent Action Fund Asia Pacific. And I am a founder of that, and I am presently on the board. And it's difficult. It's a huge region, covers such big areas, and we were registered in the Philippines. Philippines is very, very problematic at the moment. We are also registered in Australia. So we are only now beginning to find our feet, but there are huge issues of climate justice defenders, LGBTIQ defenders, and so many issues, And Asia is, frankly, we are far more hypocritical than rest of the regions. Africa is not so hypocritical. Latin America certainly not. Asia is all caught up with all this culture, Asian values and culture and all this nonsense. So we have to support the work by human rights defenders within all of this. So that's where I am on Urgent Action Fund. It is an exciting place to be. The South Asians for Human Rights, again, I am part of the founders who, or some 20 years back, we met in Nimrana. It was led by people, it was conceptualized and led by people like Asma Jahangir, Radhika Kumaraswamy, Komal Hussain from Bangladesh, Hina Jilani, and so on. And I.K. Gujral, our former prime minister, was the founding chair of South Asians for Human Rights. So for me and for many of us younger people, this is a very important platform, because if you're doing human rights work on the ground, it's important that you are also linked with some of the big names. You have the support, you have the solidarity, but then you also keep learning, no? So I have been part of South Asian for Human Rights since then. And just recently, I have become the co-chair of the Bureau. And the chair is Radhika Kumaraswamy. And I must say, I'm so pleased and I feel so privileged to be able to take this organization forward under her leadership. And also at a moment, political moment, which is very, very contested, very difficult. And yet we have to keep that regional solidarity and cohesiveness alive. And how do we do that? So these are challenges. I'm very, very happy to be part of that human rights ecosystem. And it's not just focused on women, it has, it is all. But yeah, that's where I am. We've just started. We have many things planned for the future, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you so much, Roshni, for enlightening us and then for telling us about all your experience so that we can learn from it. You have been associated with so many organizations at the national and international level, but you are also an important voice from the Northeast. So how do you balance the local and the non-local wider perspectives? How do you negotiate?
How do I negotiate? That's a tough question. I don't know, frankly. There is. I am part of Foundation for Social Transformation, FST, Enabling Northeast India. As the chair, I'm quite involved in, our strategies, what should be the focus, and so on. And so the intellectual kind of thinking behind the organization, I contribute to in a big way. But other than that, I don't think I am involved with any organization as such. Maybe people. There are so many experts now. There are so many younger people who take leadership, and I'm really not needed in any. So I don't see myself as a voice, but I am part of a political, not political, but a larger network in Assam called Husto Homaj Bikas Chakra, and we have filed litigation against the CAA. So I think I am now part of organizations which have a more definitive uh, socio-political sphere rather than just being focused on issue-based, not just gender. That's what. Let's put it. Well, we raise gender in many of these issues, but the the political context within which these issues are being raised for me is what is important. I was recently in a meeting on indigenous women, and for me, sometimes it's very frustrating that the Northeast is also kind of uh, is constantly caught in kind of a time warp of that you were victims, you had conflict, and you are this and you are that, and it's the same issues keep surfacing. Whereas today, the political context of conflict in Northeast India is very different, for instance, from what is happening in Kashmir. And the political dispensation at this moment is, for whatever reason, and I can give very many, but this is not the forum, uh, is very soft in some ways, apparently soft on many issues for the Northeast. But my concern is about the Northeast issues is that it is important, whatever issues, whether it is environment, whether it is peace building, whether it is violence, that we need to understand that it is not an isolated issue in a very far corner of the country, which is Northeast India. That you have to understand each of these issues in a larger political context. For me, for instance, on peace building in Northeast India and women's role, and a lot has been said about women's role and peace building in Northeast India. And there are many analyses of how they negotiated the terms of the ceasefire, which is great. I think it was a very important negotiation that was done at that moment. And the kind of involvement that they have had, they have been brought in, and so on. But I think that we can't just glorify what has been done. We have to keep pushing further. For me, for instance, what is a peace process actually mean in a context or with particular political forces, where with the one hand you are signing peace accords with one community, with the other hand you are making sure that commitments that were made by the government of India are not being adhered to. And here I am talking about Article 370 and 35A of Kashmir, and that women are uh, are going to be given political representation. So women who are fighting for political representation from Northeast India, will you agree to be part of, will you agree to keep quiet on other issues because you are getting your much fought for political representation? Or will you like the Kashmiri women say that we have internal gender inequalities. It's a big battle within our own communities. We'll continue to fight that battle. But we do not need you as the protector to come and help us fight our battles. We'll fight it ourselves. Okay, so I think Northeast India does need to raise this question of in peace building, what are you doing? Are you going to question what is the motive behind the offer of peace? Are you going to see what kind of economic negotiations has already taken place outside of the women? And all those things have already been agreed upon. And then you are brought in like a token to say, look, women are participating in the peace project, but already everything has been negotiated away. I have been raising this repeatedly. Even in Africa, I raised it. I said, it is not just about how many and representation, but what is being negotiated? How much power do you have to do the economic negotiation? And that's the question today I'm raising also in the Northeast context. Recently, I think we discovered diamond in Mon district of Nagaland, right? Will that change the peace negotiations in a different way? Because economic issues are huge, and we haven't really engaged. We haven't unpacked the economic issues vis-a-vis conflict transformation in this region, and that is where we need to go. See, I'm saying all this, but I am not confident that I have enough support or organizations who will raise these issues. So I say it wherever they invite me and I speak it, but many people don't want me to say it, so they do not invite me often. That's the reality. I'm sorry.
Yeah. When you talk like this, it makes me think of like something else. You say that the kind of problems that we've been facing, not just in the Nordics but everywhere. A lot of people have been engaged in it, trying to change the way things are. But sometimes it doesn't go away. Just like what you said just now. Do you often like sometimes have feel fatigued or maybe work burnout and they don't want to not talk about these things for some time, and then just you go into a corner and say, okay, I'm not going to talk about this for some time, let me just do you also have time like that?
Yes, actually, that particular moment when I joined a donor organization, there was a real intensity of working on conflict. And at that time, remember, there weren't many people. They weren't actually, so I had to constantly depend on Sri Lanka for analysis, to constantly. In fact, when we had the first international workshop in China, I had no Indians supporting me. It was Sri Lanka, and I was very new and, international forum, blah, blah, but it was always people from, so I always felt more South Asian than Indian, actually, because of that kind of support which came. So that was the moment of why did I suddenly switch from it? It was very lonely. It was very, very lonely, and it was the time when there was the in Manipur, where there was that fallout, where was it the assembly which was burnt, or there was that huge conflict between the Nagas and the Métis. It just begun, and we were trying desperately to negotiate, talking to one side, talking to the other. I went also to all the camps that, you don't leave the valley and, all of that. But it was very complex, very, very complex. And you didn't have enough people. So that was a moment of real fatigue of doing conflict work and thinking, okay, now let me take a step back and look at other contexts, which was great actually, because it just enlarged my understanding and, met you get out of your little comfort region and you meet greater challenges and then strategies. So at this moment also, yes, the kind of situation of human rights defenders is very sad and frustrating and very, very debilitating at moments. Being part of South Asians for Human Rights is something that gives you a lot of solidarity and support. So it's like an ebb and flow. There are moments where you feel very uh, kind of, frustrated and hopeless, like where will we land, where are we headed, what will happen. Yes, I do have a lot of that, but I must also say that during this COVID time, suddenly this online connections, which is sad because one is not meeting people in person, but the online connections are also so frequent that you are I actually had a Thanksgiving party this morning with friends in the US. So I mean, we are meeting people on like a weekly basis. You are constantly also giving each other support. So you are alone in your own location, but then you are also constantly connected to people thanks to the internet across the world. And that is a different level of solidarity. And we are wondering whether maybe they will curb that also at some point. I don't know. But at the moment, it's a ebb and flow. And thanks to internet, one is being able to connect. And thanks to South Asians for Human Rights, there is a lot of hope and solidarity. Thank you for asking that question. It's there are today maybe you are finding me on a happier note, so I've said this. Maybe tomorrow I will say something very. I'm totally depressed, and I don't think there's going to be any progress anywhere. So yeah, that's how it is.
You were mentioning how the COVID pandemic has affected your work, but in one way, it is helping you connect with a lot more people. How else is it affecting you and the community that you work with?
Right. Um, I mean, the pandemic is something that we didn't have any control over, but how it has played out, the catastrophization of the pandemic is totally determined by social injustices that are in are there inherent in the communities and in society, and in our context, in the political context in which it is being played out. So it's had in India, no doubt about it, the pandemic has been like a godsend to the repressive forces. It has been a huge cover of carrying on, repression of a kind unprecedented, uh, and people not being able to. I mean, look at what was the first process of sanitization they did, Shaheen Bagh, no? The CAA protests was whitewashed out of existence with the coming of the pandemic in the name of sanitation. So, under cover of the pandemic, human rights are the biggest human rights defenders have been picked up. People have not been able to come and protest. Courts are not functioning. So it has been used in such a huge way. I mean, I'm not even going into the health and the social and the migrant workers and all of that. And that is there for everybody to see. I'm just talking about human rights defenders. We've been reduced to what? We've been reduced to just court cases where one is just appealing for the barest minimum medical facilities for an 83-year-old dying man. I'm talking about Barabara Rao. We're talking about the father, Stan, just very basic. It's not even like huge things. We're not even asking for release, or we're not even, those will happen later. But even the barest minimum we are fighting for. Can you imagine? And And then we are happy even if we get that little bit. Our celebrations are when we just make like an inch of progress in one of the most basic of requirements, and we celebrate. So it has had a huge impact, and how it will play out in the future, nobody knows. Under cover of lockdown, we already saw what Kashmir has been under lockdown since 2019 August, and the pandemic just increased that lockdown. It doubled everything. People who were imprisoned, who were picked up during that lockdown, were sent to faraway prisons in Agra and wherever. And all of that continues, and we become so helpless. And again, under cover of all of this, all the things that are being moved, all the laws that are being enacted in parliament, what all has been, I mean, look at all that has been passed. Look at the environment protection laws where we are today. So it's the pandemic has been hugely beneficial to the repressive forces in being in enabling them to push for even further stringent and getting things institutionalized. So this is what brings me then to my depression, that really, where are we? On the positive, as I just said, that we are connected more than ever before, and more aware of what is, for instance, one has been so involved in the US elections, just following it, because you are so much now on the net of what is going on and the implications, if the way the present president is behaving, the implications it has for the rest of the world. You can just do whatever you feel like. The kind of push of authoritarianism, it has implications for everyone. So that kind of awareness, I think this pandemic is allowing for more reflection. In terms of being able to find space to write and so on, that was the aspiration, that was the wish, that I should be able to do, we have all the time in the world now and I can do this. But I think the political I think I'm just making excuses, though. Those who are writing are doing very well. In my own case, there have been moments of such depressing situation politically that you do not really know. You just don't feel a kind of urge to move forward and write anything and so on. The aspiration is there. I'm struggling with it. I get a lot of encouragement. I should be doing this and doing that. But to be honest, no, I don't think I've been very productive. Although the space and the time is there. I think that's all I have to say.
Have you ever faced any kind of impediment in your career or in your life because of your gender and your identity?
In terms of gender, yes, of course. In terms of my position on women's rights, yes, a lot within the family, with some close friends. Initially, you do feel, you get this sense of people are very cautious about mixing with you because you bring such radical ideas, and people are embarrassed when you raise these issues. But it's okay, because you find your own milieu and you find your own cohort of people, and they become your closest friends, and the ones who were the close friends are no longer those friends, because ideologically, if there is a barrier, then you cannot really relate after a while. Some people are still led by kindness and so on. And you know from the Northeast, since you come, what it is. Northeast is actually a very, very conservative region, which rest of India think because we are guitar strumming and we are look more Western, that we are very progressive and we are very we have progressive thinking, which is not true. It is the most conservative. I live in Shillong. Meghalaya is one of the most conservative thinking societies, uh, really, and very much, very, very conservative ideas about everything. And that is true. I think Assam might be the most progressive. Manipur is, although there are high levels of conservatism in Manipur, very, very high levels. So I know. So I have, being from the region, I have faced it within uh, the region itself, actually. And it is a delight to leave the region and go out, because you find more people that you can relate to. There are many more independent thinking women outside of the region. I mean, contrary to what people may think. When I moved to Delhi, it was such a delight. There were so many more people. You could be more, you don't have to be so restricted. Northeast is very restricted. In terms of the ethnic identity, no, I've never faced any issues. Also, because I suppose people know who you are, and I'm also kind of flag bearer of the region, and nobody's giving giving me that kind of. So ethnicity has never been an issue, and in fact, I have liked to be outside the ethnic identity question. So it was wonderful to live in New York, where you can be anonymous, and you are just like anybody else on the street. It's a great feeling. Um, it was also nice to be in Delhi, and you just fight for your right. I'm just talking about, say, little fights in your neighborhood. You fight for your right regardless of who you are. And also because I don't look very northeastern, so I suppose I could get away with it. But because when you live in Shillong, there is a lot of uh, you experience, if you are not from the community, from this state, you do experience a lot of discrimination at different moments. And to be outside of this ethnic identity kind of, this stranglehold, scaffolding that Northeast has, is very suffocating at times. And to be outside of it is very nice. So if I have suffered any of these things, it has been more in the region than outside of this region. That's the reality.
Yeah, that is the reality for many of us. Thank you so much, Rosmi, for joining us today. My last question is, I wanted to ask you, what was the happiest moment that you faced during your work?
Oh my God, that's a very difficult, very, very difficult question. I mean, there are so many happy moments, so many happy moments. Um, I don't know. I mean, if I just name one, it would seem that that was the happiest, but that's not true. Like every one of them has been a very fulfilling. Doing the women's rights, our human rights, the 5-day workshop was a path-breaking moment. Uh, Being part of the Urgent Action Fund uh, and working with people like Charlotte Bunch and Patricia Sellers. I mean, these are icons. To be able to work with them has been very significant and important moments. Being able to support really cutting edge uh, work as a donor has been very, very exciting. I mean, when you were talking about the women combatants, it wasn't even, I mean, I did the documentation much later, but actually I supported that work much earlier, even when I was a donor, and we supported the first documentation that Maoist women were doing about violence. It was, being in an organization where you could actually support that kind of work which nobody else will support. So there have been many moments as being a donor where I have been able to support work which nobody else will support, which has been really filled me with a lot of joy. Yeah, in fact, when you're talking about joy, I must mention that I did support the Lightning Testimonies. I don't know if some of you have seen this. It's a film and an installation by Amar Kanwar on violence against women, and it ends with a scene from Northeast India and Manipur. And I actually wept and so many people have wept. And I am so happy that I supported that, one has contributed in some way to that absolutely spectacular movie and documentation of violence against women done by a man who constantly checked with me whether he was feminist enough and if this scene is all right, if that is so. So, there are some of these joyful moments of supporting work which has, and you see that it has now taken shape. I'm happy that the organization that I co-founded is where it is today, even if I am not part of it. It There is a sense of happiness that it has expanded, and so many young people are involved in it, and so on. Yeah, I think overall there have been very many moments. I'm just thinking of a few. I hope I haven't left out very important ones. Yeah, but very. It has been such a beautiful kind of uh, years, decades of very, very enabling, very nurturing, very supportive, very exciting kind of journey along with other people. And then when you meet some of them that you started your journey with, there is a different level of solidarity and happiness just to go through all of that. Yeah, it's been a great journey. I was a kind of failed academic because I was a lecturer. I was told that I was a good lecturer, but my heart was just not in it. I could never continue to be a lecturer. And I am just so happy that I didn't pursue that career. I think that is like a most decisive uh, and the best choice that I made of not pursuing that line and being where I am. Yeah. No regrets.
Thank you so much, Rosmi, for taking us with you, like on your journey, through your work, and all the kind of experiences that you have had, and the kind of contributions that you have made. And it's been wonderful listening to you and learning from you. And it almost like the kind of sincerity and the kind of openness with which you have spoken about. It also takes us along with you on your journey, and we look forward to learning more from you in the future also. And thank you so much once again, Rosmi, for joining us.
Thank you, Anju, and thank you to the entire Zubaan team for thinking of me and bringing me into your project.